When a 7-foot-tall woman rode into Ezra Dalton's lonely Montana homestead in 1879, the obese cowboy never expected her bold declaration that would change both their lives forever. In a world that had rejected them both for being different, two unlikely souls discovered that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the most impossible propositions. But would their courage to stand together be enough to survive a community determined to tear them apart? A gunshot cracked across the Montana prairie, sending a flock of blackbirds spiraling into the gray morning sky. Ezra Dalton jerked awake on his wooden porch chair, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. The sound had come from somewhere beyond the rolling hills that bordered his homestead, but in the territory's endless silence, danger could travel for miles on the wind. He pushed himself up from the chair, his 300-pound frame creaking the old wood beneath him. At 34 years old, Ezra had grown used to mornings that started with aching joints and the kind of loneliness that sat heavy in his chest like stones in a creek bed. The September air of 1879 carried the sharp bite of coming winter, and he pulled his worn coat tighter around his broad shoulders. His cattle were restless in the distance, their lowing voices mixing with the whistle of prairie wind through the fence posts. Something had them spooked, and Ezra's weathered hands automatically reached for the rifle he kept by the front door. Living alone this far from Willowbrook meant depending on yourself when trouble came calling. The coffee pot on his stove had gone cold hours ago, but he poured himself a cup anyway, the bitter liquid helping to clear the fog from his mind. Through the small kitchen window, he watched the sun climb over the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, painting the grasslands in shades of gold and amber that reminded him why he'd chosen this hard life over the easier comforts of town living. A second gunshot echoed across the valley, closer this time, followed by the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. Ezra's grip tightened on his rifle as he stepped back onto the porch, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of movement. In his 10 years of homesteading, he'd learned that unexpected visitors usually meant unexpected trouble. The rider appeared first as a dark speck against the morning sky, cresting the hill that marked the eastern boundary of his property. Even from a distance, something seemed unusual about the approaching figure. The horse moved with an odd, measured gait, as if carrying a burden too heavy for normal travel. As the distance closed, Ezra's breath caught in his throat, like smoke in a chimney. The woman riding toward his homestead stood taller in the saddle than any person he'd ever seen, her flame-red hair streaming behind her like a banner in the wind. She sat her horse with the kind of confidence that spoke of years in the saddle, but her size made the large animal look almost small beneath her. His first instinct was to step back inside, to hide from this strange vision that seemed to belong more to the realm of tall tales than the ordinary world of cattle and crops. But something in the way she rode, straight-backed and purposeful, kept his feet planted on the weathered porch boards. The woman's clothes were travel-worn but well-made, her leather boots reaching nearly to her knees, her coat cut in a style that suggested she'd seen more of the world than most folk in these parts. A rifle rested across her saddle, and a pair of saddlebags bulged with supplies that spoke of a long journey from somewhere far away. As she drew nearer, Ezra could make out the details of her face, and what he saw there surprised him more than her extraordinary height. Instead of the hard expression he'd expected from someone who looked capable of handling herself in rough country, her features held a gentleness that reminded him of his mother's hands, smoothing his hair when he was small. Her eyes, the color of storm clouds gathering over the mountains, fixed on him with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. She slowed her horse to a walk as she approached the gate that marked the entrance to his property, and Ezra found himself holding his breath, without knowing why. "You, Ezra Dalton?" Her voice carried across the yard with surprising warmth, though it held the kind of strength that suggested she was used to making herself heard over long distances. He nodded, still unable to find his voice, as she dismounted with fluid grace despite her towering height. Up close, she was even more striking than she'd appeared from a distance. Her face bore the kind of tan that came from years under the open sky, and tiny lines around her eyes spoke of someone who smiled often, despite whatever hardships had brought her to this remote corner of the territory. "I'm Magnolia Reeves," she said, approaching the porch with steps that covered ground quickly. "Been riding since before dawn, following directions from the folks in Willowbrook. They told me you were a good man to know in these parts." Ezra's mind raced with questions he couldn't quite form into words. Why was this extraordinary woman looking for him? What could she possibly want with a fat, lonely homesteader who spent most of his days talking to cattle because they were the only creatures willing to listen? Yes, ma'am," he finally managed, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. "That's me, though I can't imagine what business you might have with someone like me." Magnolia stopped at the bottom of his porch steps, and even from that lower position, she stood nearly as tall as Ezra did on the raised wooden platform. The morning sun caught the copper highlights in her hair, and for a moment, he wondered if he was still dreaming in his chair, conjuring visions to fill the empty spaces in his solitary life. "Mind if I water my horse?" she asked, gesturing toward the well that stood beside his small barn. "It's been a long ride, and Thunder here could use a drink before we talk." "Of course," Ezra said quickly, grateful for the excuse to move and do something with his hands. "I'll draw the water myself. No need for you to." "I can manage," Magnolia interrupted gently, but her tone brooked no argument. "Been taking care of myself and my animals for longer than most folks have been drawing breath." As she led her horse toward the well, Ezra found himself watching the easy way she moved, the confidence in her stride that spoke of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. It was a quality he envied more than he could express, having spent most of his adult life trying to make himself invisible, to avoid the stares and whispers that followed him wherever he went. The morning wind picked up, carrying with it the scents of sage and distant rain, and Ezra realized that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. This woman, this Magnolia Reeves, had ridden into his quiet world for a reason, and something in her storm-gray eyes told him that reason would be unlike anything he'd ever heard before. What could possibly bring a woman like her to seek out a man like him? Magnolia's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she worked the well handle, drawing up bucket after bucket of clear, cold water for her travel-weary horse. Ezra watched from his porch, mesmerized by the fluid strength in her movements and the gentle way she spoke to the animal, her voice carrying the kind of affection usually reserved for family members. "Thunder's been with me for 3 years, she said, glancing back at Ezra as she filled the wooden trough. "Found him half dead from thirst outside a trading post in Kansas Territory. Owner said he was too stubborn to be worth the feed, but sometimes stubborn's exactly what you need to survive out here." The horse, a massive black gelding with white markings on his legs, nudged Magnolia's shoulder with obvious affection as he drank. Even standing next to such a large animal, her extraordinary height made her an imposing figure. But Ezra noticed how her touch remained gentle, almost maternal, as she stroked the horse's neck. "Where are you traveling from?" Ezra asked, his curiosity finally overcoming his nervousness. "Don't get many visitors this far from the main trails." "Been moving through the territories for the better part of 3 years, Magnolia replied, her attention still focused on her horse. "Started down in Texas, worked my way up through Colorado, spent some time in the Dakota Territory, looking for something I wasn't sure existed." She turned to face him then, and Ezra felt the full force of her attention like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Her eyes held depths he couldn't fathom, stories of experiences far beyond anything he'd encountered in his quiet life of cattle and solitude. "What kind of something?" he asked, though part of him wasn't sure he was ready to hear the answer. Magnolia left Thunder at the trough and approached the porch with those long ground-covering strides. When she reached the bottom step, she paused, and Ezra saw something vulnerable flicker across her features before she spoke. "A place where being different doesn't make you a target," she said simply. "People in these parts They told me you might understand what that means." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow, not because they were unkind, but because they revealed a truth he'd spent years trying to hide from himself. He did understand. Every day of his adult life, he'd felt the weight of other people's judgment. The way conversations stopped when he entered the general store, the pitying looks from the women in town who saw his loneliness as clearly as they saw his size. "I reckon I do," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Though I can't say I've done much about it beyond hiding out here, where folks don't have to look at me if they don't want to." "Hiding's one way to handle it," Magnolia said, settling onto the porch steps with surprising delicacy for someone of her size. The wooden boards creaked under her weight, but she moved as if she was used to being careful with furniture not built for people like her. "But it gets lonely after a while, doesn't it?" The simple question opened something inside Ezra's chest, a floodgate of emotions he'd kept locked away for so long he'd almost forgotten they existed. When was the last time anyone had asked him how he felt? When was the last time someone had looked at him and seen a person worthy of conversation instead of just another oddity to be politely ignored? "Every day," he confessed, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Some days I talk to the cattle just to hear a human voice, even if it's my own. Some nights the silence gets so thick, I can barely breathe through it." Magnolia nodded, understanding flickering in her storm-gray eyes. "I know that feeling. Spent 2 years traveling with a medicine show, letting people pay to gawk at the amazing Amazon woman. Told myself it was better than being alone. But being stared at isn't the same as being seen." She gestured toward the vast landscape that surrounded them, the rolling hills and endless sky that seemed to stretch beyond the edge of the world. "But out here, with all this space and freedom, maybe there's room for people like us, people who don't fit the usual molds." "People like us," Ezra repeated, tasting the words. He'd never thought of himself as part of any group before, never imagined there might be others who understood the particular weight of being perpetually different. "I've been asking questions in every town from here to the Colorado border," Magnolia continued, "asking about decent men who might understand what it means to be judged for something you can't control. Your name came up in every conversation." Ezra felt heat rise in his cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and something that might have been pride. "What did they say?" "That you're honest in your dealings, that you're kind to your animals and fair with your neighbors, even when they haven't always been fair with you. That you've never cheated anyone or spoken ill of folks who maybe deserved it." She paused, studying his face with an intensity that made his heart race. "That you're a good man who's been alone too long." The assessment hung between them like morning mist, impossible to ignore, but too fragile to examine too closely. Ezra found himself looking at his hands, rough and scarred from years of hard work, trying to reconcile the person Magnolia described with the failure he saw in the mirror each morning. "Why does that matter to you?" he asked. "Why ride all this way to find someone you've never met?" Magnolia was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun continued its climb toward noon. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that made the air itself seem to hold its breath. "Because I need something from you, Ezra Dalton. Something important enough that I've spent 3 years looking for the right person to ask." She turned to meet his eyes, and he saw determination there, mixed with something that looked like hope. "I need a man who would see my size as strength instead of strangeness. Someone who might understand that different doesn't always mean broken." She stood up from the steps, her full height creating a shadow that fell across the porch like the promise of momentous change. "I need a father for my child, a man decent enough to love something that might be as different as its parents." The words hit Ezra like lightning striking the prairie, illuminating everything around him in stark, brilliant detail, while simultaneously leaving him stunned and speechless. In all his dreams of companionship, in all his lonely fantasies of family and belonging, he had never imagined anything as direct, as honest, as terrifyingly wonderful as this moment. Tonight, Magnolia continued, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of what she was asking. If you're willing, you'll make me pregnant. I've traveled too far and waited too long to dance around what needs to be said. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire territory, filled with possibility and fear, and the kind of hope that could either save a person or destroy them completely. Ezra felt the world shift beneath his feet, as if the very ground had decided to rearrange itself according to some new and mysterious law he didn't yet understand. What kind of answer could a man give to a request that promised to change everything he thought he knew about his own life? Lightning split the sky above Ezra's cabin, as thunder crashed like falling mountains. The storm had been building all afternoon, turning the September air thick and heavy with the promise of rain. Inside the small kitchen, Magnolia sat at his wooden table, her long fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee that looked tiny in her enormous hands. "Tell me about your family," Ezra said, settling his bulky frame into the chair across from her. The furniture creaked under his weight, but he had grown used to that sound years ago. "Where did you come from before all this traveling?" Magnolia's gray eyes grew distant, like she was looking through the walls to some faraway place. "Pennsylvania," she said quietly. "My pa worked in the steel mills, and my ma took in washing. I was normal-sized until I turned 12. Then I just kept growing and growing." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows in their frames. Ezra watched her face change as she remembered, seeing the pain that lived behind her careful words. "By the time I was 15, I stood 6.5 feet tall," she continued. "The other children called me names: monster, giant, freak of nature. My parents tried to love me, but I could see the worry in their eyes every morning when I had to duck through doorways." Rain began pelting the roof like thrown pebbles. Ezra reached across the table and touched her hand gently. Her skin felt warm and soft, nothing like the rough calluses he expected from someone so strong. "What happened then?" he asked. "A traveling show came through town when I was 17. The manager saw me at the market and offered my parents money. More money than Pa made in 6 months at the mill. They said it would only be for a year, just until they could pay off their debts." Her voice cracked like dry wood. "I never saw them again." The storm outside seemed to match the sadness in her words. Ezra felt anger growing in his chest, not at her, but at all the people who had failed to see what he saw so clearly. She was beautiful, not because of her size, but because of the gentleness that lived inside someone the world had treated harshly. The show was called Professor Marvel's Cabinet of Wonders, Magnolia went on, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames in his fireplace. "I was the star attraction, the amazing Amazon, the tallest woman in America. People paid good money to gawk at me, to point and whisper, and take photographs they could show their friends back home." A massive bolt of lightning illuminated the cabin, followed immediately by thunder that shook the dishes on Ezra's shelves. Neither of them flinched. They had both lived through worse storms than this. "For 12 years, I traveled from town to town, city to city, Buffalo, Chicago, St. Louis, Denver. Always the same routine: stand on a platform, let them stare, answer their rude questions, pretend their laughter didn't cut like knives." She lifted the coffee cup to her lips with both hands. "But I saved every penny I could. Dreamed of the day I could buy my freedom and find a place where being different didn't make me a prisoner." "Is that what brought you to Montana?" Ezra asked. "Partly." She smiled for the first time since starting her story, and the expression transformed her entire face. "But mostly, it was a letter I received last winter in Salt Lake City. A woman named Mrs. Henderson had seen me perform in Denver 2 years earlier. She wrote to tell me about a place where people minded their own business and judged others by their actions instead of their appearance." The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. Ezra stood up to add more wood to the fire, his movements careful and deliberate despite his size. He had learned long ago that quick motions only made him seem clumsy. She mentioned you specifically, Magnolia said, watching him tend the flames. Said there was a rancher named Ezra Dalton who treated everyone with kindness, no matter what they looked like or where they came from. Said you were the type of man who saw people's hearts instead of their outsides. Ezra nearly dropped the poker he was holding. She wrote about me? But I barely know Mrs. Henderson. She only buys eggs from me twice a month. Sometimes that's enough, Magnolia replied. Small kindnesses have a way of traveling further than we think. When you helped carry her groceries to her wagon last spring, or when you refused to take payment for those extra eggs because she mentioned money was tight. She noticed. She remembered. He turned away from the fire to look at her. This remarkable woman, who had traveled hundreds of miles based on stories of his simple decency. The idea seemed impossible, like something from one of the adventure novels he read during long winter nights. So you came all this way because of eggs and groceries? He asked. I came because I was tired of being alone, she said simply. Tired of pretending that size doesn't matter when it's all anyone ever sees. Tired of living like some kind of curiosity, instead of a human being who wants the same things everyone else wants. Another flash of lightning brightened the room, and in that brief moment, Ezra saw something in her expression that made his breath catch. It was hope, fragile and careful, but unmistakably real. And what is it you want, Magnolia? He asked softly. She stood up slowly, her head nearly touching the ceiling beams. When she spoke, her voice was strong and clear, despite the emotion behind the words. I want a home where I don't have to apologize for taking up space. I want someone who sees me as a woman first and a giant second. I want children who will grow up knowing that different doesn't mean wrong. She paused, meeting his eyes directly. And I want to give all of those things to someone who understands what it's like to be judged by appearances instead of character. The storm outside was reaching its peak, but inside the cabin, everything felt still and charged with possibility. Ezra realized that this moment would change everything, that whatever happened next would determine the course of both their lives. Tomorrow, he said, his voice barely audible above the rain, I'd like you to see the ranch properly. Meet the animals. Walk the property. See if this place could ever feel like home to you. Magnolia smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. I'd like that very much. But as another crash of thunder shook the cabin, neither of them noticed the shadowy figures watching from the ridge above the house, waiting for the storm to pass so they could make their move. The morning sun painted the Montana grassland gold as Magnolia stepped outside, stretching her arms toward the endless sky. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and fresh, filled with the scent of wet earth and growing things. Ezra was already by the barn, pitching hay to his cattle, his broad back moving in steady rhythm. Sleep well? He called out when he saw her approaching. Better than I have in months, she replied truthfully. The small guest room had felt like a palace compared to the cramped carnival wagons she was used to. Your bed doesn't creak when someone my size moves around. They worked together through the morning, and Magnolia found herself amazed by how naturally they fell into partnership. When Ezra needed something from a high shelf in the barn, she reached it without being asked. When she struggled with the heavy milk pail, he took it without making her feel weak or incapable. You've got away with animals, Ezra observed as they watched his horses nuzzle against Magnolia's outstretched hands. They trust you right away. Animals don't care about size, she said, stroking the nose of a gentle mare named Buttercup. They judge by actions and intentions. I wish more people were like that. Around noon, they were mending a section of fence when dust clouds appeared on the horizon. Ezra shaded his eyes with his hand, squinting at the approaching riders. Company coming, he said, but something in his tone made Magnolia look up sharply. Friends of yours? Not exactly. Ezra set down his hammer and walked toward the house, his expression growing serious. That's Sheriff Coleman's horse in front. The others. I recognize Mayor Thornfield and his son Pete, plus a couple of men from town. Magnolia felt her stomach tighten. She had experienced this scene too many times before. The sudden appearance of authority figures, the demands that she move along, the threats and accusations that always followed when people like her stayed in one place too long. "Maybe I should go inside," she suggested. "No." Ezra's voice was firm but gentle. "This is your home now. If you want it to be, nobody has the right to make you hide." The riders approached slowly, their horses picking their way carefully across the muddy ground left by the previous night's storm. Sheriff Coleman dismounted first, his weathered face serious but not unkind. The others remained on horseback, forming a loose semicircle around the yard. "Morning, Ezra," the sheriff said, touching the brim of his hat. "Sorry to disturb you, but we've had some concerns raised in town about your house guest here." "What kind of concerns?" Ezra asked, moving to stand beside Magnolia. Mayor Thornfield urged his horse forward, his thin face pinched with disapproval. "The kind that affects the moral character of our community," he declared pompously. "We've heard about this woman's profession, about the unseemly displays she's been involved in." Magnolia felt heat rise in her cheeks. But before she could respond, Ezra stepped forward. "Miss Reeves is a guest in my home," he said quietly. "She's done nothing wrong, and neither have I." "Come now, Dalton," said Pete Thornfield, the mayor's son. He was a young man with cruel eyes and a smirking mouth that Magnolia instantly disliked. "We all know what kind of woman travels alone with circus folk, what kind of entertainment she provides for paying customers." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a dirty fire. Magnolia had heard worse, much worse. But something about the sneering way Pete delivered his words made her hands clench into fists. "Watch your tongue, boy," Ezra said, his voice carrying a warning that surprised everyone present. "You're talking about a lady." Pete laughed, a harsh sound that made the horses shift nervously. "Lady? Look at her, Dalton. She's a freak, a carnival attraction. You think someone like that knows anything about being a proper woman?" "I know enough," Magnolia said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "to recognize a small man when I see one, regardless of his actual size." The words hit Pete like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and his hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip. "Easy there, Pete," Sheriff Coleman warned, but his eyes never left Magnolia's face. "Ma'am, I don't know you, but I know Ezra Dalton. He's good people. If he says you're a lady, that's enough for me." "It's not enough for the decent folks in town," Mayor Thornfield declared. "We have families to think about. Children who might see this arrangement and get the wrong ideas about proper behavior." "What arrangement?" Magnolia demanded, her patience finally snapping. "I'm staying in a guest room. We're not sharing a bed or engaging in any behavior that would concern your precious children." "Yet," Pete said with a nasty grin. "But we all know what you really came here for. What you people do when you think nobody's watching." This time, Magnolia's temper exploded like dynamite. She took 3 quick steps forward, and suddenly Pete was looking up at her from his saddle, his earlier bravado evaporating as he realized just how much bigger and stronger she was. "You want to know what I came here for?" she said, her voice deadly quiet. "I came here looking for a place where people judge others by their character instead of their appearance. I came here hoping to find someone who would see past the surface to the person underneath." She gestured toward Ezra, who was watching the confrontation with a mixture of pride and concern. "I found a man who treats his animals with kindness, who pays his debts on time, who helps his neighbors without expecting anything in return. A man who looks at me and sees a woman instead of a spectacle." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "If that threatens your sense of morality, the problem isn't with us, it's with you." Sheriff Coleman nodded slowly. "She's got a point, gentlemen. I've seen nothing here that breaks any laws or threatens anyone's well-being." "The law isn't everything, Sheriff," Mayor Thornfield protested. "There are standards of decency to consider, community values to uphold." "Whose values?" Ezra asked, his voice gaining strength. "The values that say people like us don't deserve happiness? The values that measure worth by appearance instead of actions? He moved to stand directly beside Magnolia, and though she towered over him by more than a foot, they somehow looked perfectly matched. I've lived in this community for 10 years, Ezra continued. I've been honest in my dealings, helpful to my neighbors, faithful to my word, but I've never felt like I truly belonged here until now. Until she arrived, Pete sneered. Until I stopped trying to be someone I'm not, to please people who will never accept me anyway. Ezra corrected. Miss Reeves didn't change me. She helped me remember who I was before the world convinced me I was wrong. The confrontation stretched taut as a rope, with both sides waiting for someone to make the next move. But as the sun climbed higher overhead and the morning birds continued their cheerful songs, Magnolia realized that something important was happening here. Something that would determine not just their immediate future, but the kind of life they could build together. The question was, would love and acceptance prove stronger than fear and prejudice? The sound of gunshots cracked through the morning air like lightning splitting wood. Ezra's coffee cup shattered against the porch boards as he dove for cover behind the wooden rail. More shots followed, but these weren't aimed at him. They were warning shots, fired into the sky by men who wanted to make sure everyone knew they meant business. "Get inside!" Magnolia shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos as she grabbed Ezra's arm and pulled him toward the cabin door. Through the dust cloud kicked up by the approaching horses, he could see at least 8 riders thundering toward his property, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats and bandanas. But these weren't ordinary bandits or cattle rustlers. As they drew closer, Ezra recognized the expensive horses, the fine leather saddles, and the polished boots that marked them as wealthy men playing at being dangerous. His stomach dropped as he spotted the familiar face of Judge Blackthorne, leading the group, a man whose hatred for anything different had poisoned the territory for years. "Dalton!" Blackthorne's voice boomed across the yard as the riders formed a semicircle around the cabin. "Come out here and face what you've brought on yourself." Magnolia pressed herself against the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. "There's more coming from the east," she whispered, her face pale. "Looks like they've got us surrounded." Ezra's mind raced. Judge Blackthorne owned half the businesses in 3 counties and had the ear of every politician from here to Denver. If he had decided that Ezra and Magnolia were a problem that needed solving, their situation had just become deadly serious. "What do they want?" Ezra asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "You know exactly what we want," came another voice from outside this one, belonging to Reverend Mills, whose sermons about moral purity had been growing more violent with each passing Sunday. "We want that freak woman gone from decent territory." The word freak hit Magnolia like a physical blow. Ezra watched her shoulders sag as old wounds reopened, the confidence she'd been building over the past weeks crumbling like a house built on sand. "They're not going to just ride away," she said quietly. "Men like that don't stop until they get what they want." Outside, the sound of more horses approached. Ezra risked a glance through the window, and his heart sank further. At least 20 men now surrounded his property, some carrying torches despite the morning sun. The message was clear: comply, or watch everything burn. "Maybe I should go," Magnolia whispered, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. "If I leave, they'll have no reason to hurt you." "No." The word came out harder than Ezra had intended. "I won't let you run again. I won't let them win." But even as he spoke, doubt crept into his mind like poison. What could 2 people do against so many? How could they fight an entire system designed to crush anyone who dared to be different? Judge Blackthorne's voice rose again, this time with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "You've got 5 minutes to send her out, Dalton. After that, we start making decisions for you." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire. Ezra looked at Magnolia, seeing the fear in her eyes, but also something else, a spark of the same defiance that had brought her to his door in the first place. "What if we don't run?" she asked suddenly. What if we make them face what they really are? Before Ezra could ask what she meant, Magnolia was moving toward the door, not to surrender, but with the purposeful stride of someone who had made a decision that would change everything. She threw open the cabin door and stepped onto the porch, her full 7-foot height making every man in the yard crane their necks upward. The morning sun caught her red hair like fire, and for a moment, she looked less like a woman under siege and more like some ancient goddess of war. "You want to see a freak?" she called out, her voice carrying across the yard with enough force to make the horses sidestep nervously. "Then look at yourselves, 20 grown men with guns, afraid of one woman who's different from you." Judge Blackthorn's face flushed red beneath his hat brim. "You watch your tongue, woman. You're in no position to caff." "I'm in the perfect position," Magnolia interrupted, stepping to the edge of the porch. "Up here where I can see exactly what you are, cowards who hide behind numbers because you're too weak to face your own fears." The accusation hit its mark. Several of the men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, and Ezra could see doubt creeping into faces that had been set with righteous anger just moments before. But Judge Blackthorn wasn't finished. He dismounted and walked closer to the porch, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "You think your size makes you powerful? You think being a carnival oddity gives you some kind of authority here?" "I think being honest gives me authority," Magnolia replied, her voice steady despite the obvious danger. "Something you wouldn't know anything about." The judge's face darkened further. "What's that supposed to mean?" Magnolia smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "It means I know about your trips to Denver, Judge. I know about the gambling debts and the money you've been skimming from the county treasury to pay them off." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the assembled men. Judge Blackthorn's hand moved toward his gun, but Ezra was already moving, stepping out of the cabin to stand beside Magnolia. "She's not the only one who knows," Ezra said, his voice carrying a confidence that surprised even him. "Word travels fast in small territories, especially when someone's been asking the right questions in the right places." It was a bluff. They had no proof of anything. But sometimes the truth of a person's character was written so clearly on their face that evidence became unnecessary. Judge Blackthorn's guilty expression told the entire story. "You're lying," the judge snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Magnolia asked. "Then why don't we ride into town right now and discuss it with Sheriff Coleman? I'm sure he'd be very interested in learning where all that missing tax money went." The standoff stretched tight as a bowstring. Around them, the other men were beginning to mutter among themselves, doubt replacing certainty as they realized they might have been following a corrupt man's personal vendetta rather than serving justice. But Judge Blackthorn was a desperate man now, and desperate men were dangerous in ways that righteous ones weren't. His hand closed around his pistol grip, and Ezra realized that their gamble had just raised the stakes to life and death. The next few seconds would determine whether courage could triumph over corruption, or whether two people who had finally found love would pay the ultimate price for daring to be different in a world that demanded conformity. The metallic click of Judge Blackthorn's pistol, being drawn from its holster, seemed to echo across the entire Montana landscape. Time slowed to a crawl as Ezra watched the man's face twist with desperate rage, the kind that came from having your darkest secrets dragged into the light. "Nobody threatens me on my own territory," Blackthorn snarled, raising the weapon toward Magnolia's towering figure. But before he could take aim, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Lower that gun, Judge. Right now." Every head turned toward the voice, and Ezra felt his heart leap as he saw Sheriff Coleman riding up the path, his deputy flanking him on either side. But these weren't the same men who had visited days earlier with threats and demands. Coleman's face was grim with purpose, and his own weapon was already drawn. "This doesn't concern you, Sheriff," Judge Blackthorn said, though he didn't lower his pistol. "I'm handling a situation that threatens the moral fabric of our community." "Funny thing about moral fabric," Coleman replied. dismounting slowly, but keeping his gun trained on the judge. It tends to unravel when you pull the wrong thread. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded document. "This here's a warrant for your arrest, Judge." Seems someone's been asking questions about missing county funds, and the territorial government sent investigators. They found your gambling markers in 3 different Denver establishments. The words hit Judge Blackthorne like physical blows. Around him, the men who had followed him began to back their horses away, suddenly eager to distance themselves from their former leader. "That's impossible," Blackthorne whispered. But his gun hand was shaking now. "Is it?" Sheriff Coleman asked. "Because I've got signed statements from poker dealers, hotel clerks, and bank officials. Seems you've been living a double life, Judge. Preaching morality on Sundays, while stealing from the people who trusted you the rest of the week." Reverend Mills, who had been one of the loudest voices calling for action against Magnolia, suddenly looked like a man who had swallowed something bitter. "Judge, please tell me this isn't true." But Blackthorne's silence was answer enough. The righteous anger that had driven him to Ezra's property crumbled away, leaving behind only a broken man who had gambled away his honor along with the county's money. "Drop the weapon," Coleman commanded, his voice carrying the full authority of the law. For a moment it seemed like Blackthorne might fight. His eyes darted between the sheriff, Magnolia, and the path that led away from his ruined life. But whatever desperate calculation he was making reached its conclusion, and his pistol fell to the ground with a soft thud. As Deputy Harrison moved forward to place handcuffs on the former judge, Sheriff Coleman turned his attention to the remaining men. "The rest of you can head home now. Show's over." "What about them?" asked one of the riders, pointing toward Ezra and Magnolia. "What about what's not natural?" Coleman studied the couple standing together on the porch, the obese cowboy and the giant woman who had somehow found love in a world that told them they weren't worthy of it. His weathered face softened slightly. "You know what's not natural?" he said finally. "A man stealing from widows and orphans while pretending to serve God. A community turning on 2 people whose only crime was finding happiness together." He gestured toward Ezra and Magnolia. "Those 2 have shown more genuine decency in the past month than some folks show in a lifetime." One by one, the riders began to disperse, their moral certainty shattered by the revelation of their leader's corruption. Some looked ashamed, others simply confused, but all of them seemed eager to be anywhere else. As the dust settled and the last of the horses disappeared over the horizon, Sheriff Coleman approached the porch. "I owe you both an apology," he said, removing his hat. "I let fear and prejudice cloud my judgment, and that's not acceptable for a man wearing this badge." "You came when it mattered," Magnolia replied, her voice gentle, despite everything that had just happened. "That's what counts." Ezra found his voice, though it still shook slightly from the adrenaline. "How did you know? About the judge, I mean." Coleman's expression grew thoughtful. "Started wondering about it after our last visit. Got to thinking about how quick he was to stir up trouble over you 2, and it didn't sit right. Man that eager to point fingers usually has something to hide." He paused, studying them both. "Plus, my Martha's been after me about giving you folks a fair chance. Said anyone could see you're good for each other." The words hit Ezra with unexpected force. After years of feeling invisible, dismissed, or mocked, the simple acknowledgement that his happiness mattered felt like a miracle. "What happens now?" Magnolia asked. "Now you live your lives," Coleman said simply. "The judge will face trial in Denver, and I suspect most folks will be too embarrassed about following him to give you any more trouble." He smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "Besides, word's already spreading about how you 2 stood up to 20 armed men without flinching. That kind of courage earns respect, even from people who might not understand your situation." As the sheriff prepared to leave, he turned back one more time. "There's something else," he said. "The territorial governor's been talking about opening new settlements further west, places where people can make fresh starts without the weight of old prejudices. Might be something to consider. if you're interested in helping build a community from the ground up." The suggestion hung in the air like morning mist, full of possibility and promise. Ezra looked at Magnolia and saw his own excitement reflected in her storm-gray eyes. "Think about it," Coleman added, mounting his horse. "A place where being different isn't a curse. It's just another way of being human." As the sheriff rode away, Ezra and Magnolia found themselves alone again. But this time the solitude felt different. They weren't hiding from the world anymore. They were choosing their place in it. "A fresh start," Magnolia mused, her hand finding his. "Somewhere we could build something new. Together," Ezra added, the word carrying all the weight of promise and possibility. The Montana sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the world in shades of gold and hope. In the distance, cattle lowed peacefully in their pastures, and the wind carried the scent of wildflowers and new grass. For the first time in either of their lives, the future stretched ahead like an open road, wide enough for people of any size to walk it with dignity and love. Blood dripped from Magnolia's split lip as she stumbled backward into their cabin, her dress torn and muddy from the struggle outside. 3 men had cornered her at the well while Ezra was checking the cattle, their cruel laughter still echoing in her ears as she barricaded the door with shaking hands. They said, "I'm a monster," she whispered to the empty room, touching her swollen cheek. "Said no decent woman grows that tall unless the devil had a hand in it." Winter had been brutal in the Montana Territory during 1880, trapping them in their small home for weeks at a time. The isolation had given the townspeople too much time to whisper, to plan, to decide that the giant woman and her fat husband were somehow poisoning their community just by existing. Ezra burst through the door 20 minutes later, his face red from running. "Magnolia, are you hurt? I saw the horses riding away, and Mrs. Peterson said there was trouble at our place." She turned away from him, ashamed of her tears. "Maybe they're right, Ezra. Maybe I am too much for this world." "Don't you dare," he said, crossing the room in 3 quick steps. His gentle hands cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Don't you let their fear make you small." But something had broken inside Magnolia during that attack. For days, she barely spoke, spending hours staring out the frosted window at the endless white landscape. Ezra tried everything he could think of, making her favorite stew, reading aloud from the newspaper, even attempting to sing the songs she loved. Nothing worked. Then, on a Tuesday morning when the snow was falling so thick they couldn't see their own barn, a knock came at the door. Ezra opened it to find a small, dark-haired woman bundled in furs, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I'm looking for Magnolia Reeves," she said, her voice carrying a strange accent he couldn't place. She's not feeling well for visitors right now," Ezra replied carefully. "My name is Elena Vasquez," the woman continued. "I've traveled very far to find her. Please, it's about her family." Magnolia appeared behind Ezra like a shadow, her red hair hanging loose around her shoulders. "What family?" she asked, her voice hollow. "Everyone I ever loved is dead." Elena smiled, and suddenly her whole face transformed. "Not everyone, sister. Not everyone." The word hung in the air like a church bell. "Sister." Magnolia's knees went weak, and Ezra had to catch her arm to keep her from falling. "That's impossible," Magnolia breathed. "My parents only had one child. Me. Your father had another wife before your mother," Elena explained, stepping into their warm cabin. "In Mexico, before he moved north. I am your half-sister, and I have been searching for you for 5 years." Ezra watched his wife's face cycle through disbelief, hope, and finally, cautious joy. "How did you find me?" "I heard stories," Elena said, settling into their kitchen chair. "Stories of a woman so tall she could touch the clouds, living with a kind man in the Montana Territory. I knew it had to be you." As the women talked through the night, sharing memories and filling in the gaps of their separate lives, Ezra felt something shift in their small cabin. The walls seemed to expand, the air grew warmer, and for the first time since the attack, Magnolia's laughter rang out clear and true. But Elena had brought more than just family reunion. She carried with her a letter, sealed with red wax, that would change everything they thought they knew about their future. "There is something else," Elena said as dawn broke outside their windows. "Something about why we grew the way we did. About why we're different from other people." She handed the letter to Magnolia with trembling fingers. "This came from a doctor in San Francisco. He studies people like us, people who grow taller or larger than normal. He says there might be others, and he wants to meet us." Magnolia broke the wax seal with careful fingers, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting. As she read, her expression changed from curiosity to amazement to something that looked almost like relief. "He says we're not freaks," she whispered. "He says we're just different. Like some people have blue eyes and others have brown. He says there might be a whole community of people like us in California." Ezra felt his heart skip a beat. "A community? A place where being tall isn't seen as a curse," Elena added. "Where being different isn't seen as wrong." The three of them sat in silence as the implications sank in. Outside, the Montana wind howled against their windows, but inside their cabin, the temperature seemed to rise with possibility. "What would we do there?" Ezra asked finally. Magnolia looked at him with eyes that held more hope than he'd seen in months. "We could be ourselves," she said simply. "We could stop hiding." But leaving Montana meant leaving everything they'd built together, everything they'd fought to protect. It meant starting over again in a place they'd never seen, with people they'd never met. "It's a long journey," Elena warned. "Dangerous, especially for people like us. Not everyone we meet along the way will be kind." Magnolia stood up, her full height filling the small cabin. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't hunch her shoulders or try to make herself smaller. "I'm tired of living my life based on other people's kindness," she said. "It's time we found our own place in this world." She turned to Ezra, her hand extended. "Will you come with me?" He looked at her outstretched hand, then at Elena's encouraging smile, then back at the woman he'd fallen in love with. In her eyes, he saw not just hope, but determination. Not just love, but courage. "When do we leave?" he asked, taking her hand in both of his. Outside, the storm was already beginning to clear, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew, calling them toward a future they'd never dared to imagine. The train wheels clicked against the rails in a steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack to their new life as they rolled through the California valleys in early spring of 1881. Ezra pressed his face to the window, marveling at the green hills and blooming wildflowers that stretched as far as he could see. "Look at all that space," he said to Magnolia, who sat beside him reading a letter they'd received that morning. "It's like the whole world opened up." She smiled, folding the paper carefully. "Dr. Harrison says there are already 12 families living in the community. 12 families of people like us, Ezra. Can you imagine?" Elena, who had become their constant companion and guide during the long journey west, leaned forward from her seat across the aisle. "My friend Rosa visited there last year," she said. "She told me they have their own school, their own store, even their own church. Everything built for people of all sizes." But as their train pulled into the San Francisco station, Ezra felt his old fears creeping back. What if they didn't fit in, even among other different people? What if this Dr. Harrison was just another person who wanted to stare at them like circus attractions? Their questions were answered within an hour of arrival. A man nearly as tall as Magnolia, with kind eyes and a gentle voice, greeted them on the platform. "You must be the Daltons," he said, extending a hand to Ezra. "I'm Dr. Samuel Harrison, and I cannot tell you how happy I am that you decided to come." He led them through the busy streets of San Francisco to a quiet neighborhood where the houses looked different. Taller doors, wider hallways, everything built with consideration for people of unusual size. "This is where most of our community lives during the winter months," Dr. Harrison explained as they walked. "In the summer, many families move to the ranch we've established, about 50 miles north. More space for farming and raising animals. They turned a corner and found themselves facing a sight that took Ezra's breath away. In a small park, children were playing, but these weren't ordinary children. Some were tall for their age, others were shorter, and a few looked exactly like the children Ezra remembered from his own childhood. But they were all playing together, laughing together, accepted together. The children adjust fastest, Dr. Harrison observed, following Ezra's gaze. They don't carry the years of hurt that we adults do. A woman approached them from across the park, and Ezra's eyes widened. She was even taller than Magnolia, but she moved with confidence and grace, her head held high. "Welcome," she said warmly. "I'm Catherine Mills, and my husband and I run the community school. Are you the family from Montana?" "We are," Magnolia replied. And Ezra heard something in her voice he'd never heard before: pride. She wasn't apologizing for her height or trying to make herself seem smaller. She was simply existing, fully and completely. "Wonderful," Catherine continued. "We have a house ready for you, and there's a position open at the ranch if you're interested in working with cattle, Mr. Dalton." Over the following weeks, Ezra and Magnolia settled into a life they had never dared to dream possible. Ezra worked with the cattle at the community ranch, his experience from Montana making him valuable to the operation. Magnolia helped at the school, where her gentle nature and quick mind made her a favorite among the children. But the most remarkable change was in how they saw themselves. For the first time in their lives, they weren't the tallest person or the heaviest person in every room. They were simply Ezra and Magnolia, husband and wife, valued members of a community that celebrated differences instead of hiding them. "I keep waiting for it to feel too good to be true," Magnolia confessed one evening, as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the California hills gold and orange. "Maybe that's what happiness feels like when you've never had it before," Ezra replied, taking her hand. "Maybe it's supposed to feel impossible." Elena, who had decided to stay in California and make a new life for herself, joined them on the porch with a cup of coffee and a letter from Montana. "News from Sheriff Coleman," she announced, settling into the chair they'd built specially for their evening conversations. "He says the town has been asking about you two." "Asking what?" Ezra wondered. Elena grinned. "Asking when you're coming back to visit. Seems like once you left, people started realizing what they'd lost. Not the giant woman and the fat man, but the kindest neighbors they'd ever had." Magnolia squeezed Ezra's hand. "Maybe we will visit someday," she said. "But not to prove anything to them, just to show them that we're happy." As summer turned to autumn, Ezra found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this place. He thought about the lonely mornings in Montana when he believed he would never find love. He remembered the fear in Magnolia's eyes when the townspeople attacked her. He recalled the moment when they decided to trust each other enough to build a life together. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked her one night as they prepared for bed in their California home. "The way things were before? The simplicity of it?" Magnolia considered the question, brushing her long red hair in front of their bedroom mirror. "I miss the idea that love was enough," she said finally. "But I don't miss believing that we had to shrink ourselves to deserve it." "And now?" She turned to face him, her storm-gray eyes reflecting the lamplight. "Now I know that love isn't about finding someone who accepts you despite your differences. It's about finding someone who loves you because of them. Someone who sees your differences as gifts, not burdens." Outside their window, they could hear the sounds of their community children laughing, adults talking on porches, the distant sound of music from someone's piano. It was the sound of belonging, of home, of a place where different was not just accepted, but celebrated. As Ezra drifted off to sleep that night, with Magnolia's hand in his and the California stars shining through their window, he realized that their story wasn't about overcoming their differences. It was about discovering that their differences were exactly what the world needed, exactly what each other needed, exactly what made their love not just possible, but powerful. And in the morning, they would wake up in a place where giants and gentle souls could walk tall together, where love grew best, not in spite of differences, but because of them, where two people who had spent their lives feeling too big for the world had finally found a world big enough for both of them.